They called her a liar before she ever opened her mouth. He knew the truth before it ruined him. And in Calico Ridge, truth had a way of waiting until it cost everything. The wind carried the promise of winter, sharp and dry, and the town was already holding its breath. By sundown, someone would be condemned, not by proof, but by silence. Calico Ridge, late afternoon, autumn of 1888. The air bit just enough to sting the lungs, though the dust in the market square hung heavy and unmoving, as if even the wind refused to interfere. Market day should have been loud with barter and laughter, but something darker had settled over it. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with traders, women clutching baskets against their skirts, old men leaning on canes with eyes that claimed they had seen every kind of human cruelty there was to see. Today, they had come for a new kind of spectacle. At the center of the square stood Elsie Ray Holloway. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back, rope biting into skin already raw, iron shackles locking her ankles together. Her dark hair was tangled with dust and sweat, her once neat dress faded, travel-stained, torn at the hem. Hanging from her neck by twine was a crudely made sign, cardboard rough at the edges, the ink uneven and angry. Conwoman. Liar. Baby thief. The crowd pressed in close, a living wall of judgment. Fingers pointed. Faces twisted with sneers. Some watched in silence, arms folded, as if weighing her worth like spoiled produce. A few older women whispered prayers, though their eyes carried far more condemnation than mercy. A stout woman in a sun-faded bonnet stepped forward and flicked an apple rind toward Elsie's feet. "You'd steal a newborn from her own blood," she snarled. "What kind of creature does that?" The voices swelled. Rumors of the vanished Montrose family, wealthy landowners who had disappeared without warning weeks earlier, had spread through Calico Ridge like wildfire. Then someone found a newborn alone in a shack near the creek, and Elsie inside, tending the child as if she were her own. At first, some had called it kindness. That didn't last. When Elsie couldn't produce a witness, couldn't show a deed or a church record or anything but her own word, suspicion clamped down hard. She said the Montroses had entrusted the baby to her. She said there was a letter, a written agreement. No one in that square had seen it. In a town where land and bloodlines mattered more than mercy, the simplest story became the most believable. She had invented everything to claim the child and, eventually, the Montrose estate. Elsie did not cry out. She didn't beg. She didn't plead for mercy or scream her innocence. She stood still, back straight, face pale but steady, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. That silence worked against her. An innocent woman would fight, they whispered. An innocent woman would scream. At the edge of the gathering stood Jonas Vance, 32 years old, lean from years of work on Blackstone Ranch, boots still streaked with morning mud. His hands rested deep in his coat pockets. He said nothing. He accused no one. His expression gave nothing away. He was the only man there who had seen Elsie differently, weeks earlier, on a storm-lashed night when she had come to his door soaked through, shaking, clutching a crumpled piece of paper and begging him to read it. The letter was still clear in his mind, now hidden away in a locked chest back at the ranch. He was the only one who could prove she was telling the truth. But to bring it forward would expose more than her innocence. The letter spoke of panic and haste. The Montroses had fled ahead of a brewing investigation into their land dealings. It begged Elsie to care for their infant daughter until the danger passed. And in the margin, almost as an afterthought, was a name that had hollowed Jonas out when he first read it, his own. The words hinted that he was Everett Montrose's illegitimate son, a truth he had never shared with anyone. If Jonas stepped forward, if he confirmed the letter's authenticity, he would be tearing open his own past, unraveling the respect he had spent a lifetime earning in Calico Ridge. He had built Blackstone with his hands, worked from dark to dark, refused favors, refused whispers of lineage. So he stayed where he was. He did not shout. He did not move. The crowd jeered. Elsie's quiet only deepened their certainty. And Jonas's silence came not from doubt, but from fear. As the sun burned overhead and dust swirled around their boots, a woman stood condemned not by evidence, but by the absence of courage. The rain that night fell soft but relentless, soaking the dirt road that led from the chapel toward Blackstone Ranch. Horses were already stabled, lanterns turned low. Jonas had just finished his supper when the knock came. He opened the door to a figure barely holding herself upright. Elsie Ray Holloway stood drenched, hair plastered to her face, boots filled with water. She clutched a bundle close to her chest. Without waiting for permission, she lifted her eyes to his, wide and frightened. "They told me to trust you," she whispered. "They wrote it in the letter. They left the baby with me." She placed the bundle into his arms. A child, only weeks old, warm and asleep. Before Jonas could speak, she pulled a folded letter from her coat, the paper soggy, trembling in her hand. He took it inside, crouched near the fire, coaxing the pages dry. The ink had bled in places, but the signature remained. Eleanor Montrose. He read in silence. Eleanor wrote of fear, of a land scheme collapsing, of authorities closing in. She thanked Elsie for her loyalty, for agreeing to protect their daughter. And in the final lines, she revealed the truth Jonas had never dared voice, that he was Everett Montrose's son, unacknowledged but real. His jaw clenched. He looked up at Elsie, still standing there dripping rain onto his floor, eyes pleading not for comfort but belief. Jonas asked her to wait outside. Alone, he pulled a second letter from a drawer, the duplicate she had brought as insurance. He stared at it, then struck a match and burned it, watching the flames curl the paper into ash. He kept the original, locking it away. Not to protect her. To protect himself. He told himself it was temporary. That the Montroses would return. That it wasn't his mess to fix. But each day after, he rode past the old chapel where the baby had been taken. Each night, he heard the rumors grow. They said Elsie was mad. They said she hadn't cried once. Jonas said nothing. And now she stood alone, called a liar, while the weight of his silence grew heavier by the hour. The courthouse had never felt so crowded. Chairs scraped hard against the wooden floor, boots scuffed, hats were pulled off and clutched tight to chests. Whispers jumped from row to row like sparks in dry grass. The town council had called an emergency hearing the moment word spread that Jonas Vance of Blackstone Ranch intended to speak on behalf of Elsie Ray Holloway. Jonas stood at the center of the room, flanked by two deputies who looked unsure whether they were there to protect him or restrain him. He wore no hat. His shirt was clean but wrinkled, as though he had dressed without looking at himself. In his hands he held a folded letter, dried carefully and pressed between waxed linen to keep the fragile ink intact. He gripped it with both hands, knuckles pale, the way a man might hold a Bible when everything else had failed him. "I have something to read," he said. His voice did not shake, but it carried the strain of a man who had not slept. A letter written by Eleanor Montrose 3 weeks before she and her husband fled this town. The room stilled. Jonas unfolded the paper slowly and began to read. Line by line, the words filled the space, clear and deliberate. A mother's voice spoke through him, entrusting her infant daughter to Miss Elsie Holloway, praising her honesty, her courage, her devotion. The letter described the land scheme unraveling, the investigation looming, the fear that innocent lives would be crushed beneath scandal. It begged the town to protect Elsie if the family did not return. And at the end, in plain, unadorned words, Eleanor wrote that Jonas Vance was to be trusted, that he had more right to the Montrose name than most who carried it. Silence fell, deep and absolute. No one moved. Then the murmurs crept in, low and sharp. "He's claiming to be a Montrose," someone hissed. "He's lying. He wants the land." A man surged to his feet. Mr. Baylor, a trader known for loud opinions and louder debts, jabbed a finger toward Jonas. "Convenient, isn't it?" he barked. "A miracle letter and a bastard son just in time to save the woman he fancies. He's not clearing her name. He's after a fortune. Jonas didn't flinch. From the back, Mrs. Stoddard, who ran the grocer's, called out, her voice cutting. She fooled him. Got him tangled up. Maybe she's carrying his child next. Laughter rippled, ugly and sharp. Jonas raised his voice over it. I'm not here to claim land. I'm here because I let a lie grow bigger than my fear. The mayor leaned forward, hands clasped. Mr. Vance, he said carefully. Without corroboration, without the Montroses themselves, this letter proves nothing. We cannot let hearsay endanger this town. Near the rear door, Elsie sat in shackles. She didn't cry. Her face remained still, but something in her eyes dimmed. She looked at Jonas for a long moment, then said softly, I told you. The truth can't save anyone who doesn't want it. Jonas opened his mouth, but no words came. He had bared his past, offered humiliation, placed everything he was into their hands. And still, they didn't believe. They believed she had ensnared him. They believed the baby was a scheme. They believed truth had to look clean to be real. The council postponed judgment, promising investigation, but the verdict already lived in the glances and sneers. Jonas stepped down. No one met his eyes. As he passed Elsie, she didn't look up. In that quiet, Jonas understood they hadn't rejected the truth. They had rejected her. That night the wind cut colder than it should have, rattling shutters, sweeping empty streets. Tomorrow, Elsie would be taken away. Jonas didn't sleep. Before dawn, dressed in dark clothes, he saddled his horse without lighting a lantern. He rode along the edges of town, heart pounding, guilt heavy as iron. The jail stood squat and grim, lantern swaying. He waited, watched the guard's rhythm, then moved. He worked the maintenance hatch with his knife, metal groaning under pressure. The lock gave just enough. A voice shouted. Jonas lunged. The fight was brutal and fast, untrained and desperate. A blow cracked his ribs. Another split his brow. He went down hard. Inside, Elsie heard it. Jonas, she cried. They dragged her out, threw her beside him, shackled them both, and hauled them into the lowest cell. Damp stone, rusted bars, darkness pressing close. Jonas gasped, blood slick on his face. I tried, he rasped. I know, she said. You came. In that cell, bruised and broken, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. She wiped the blood from his cheek with her sleeve. He didn't deserve the kindness, and that made it heavier. The cell was cold, the lamp flickering weak. Jonas finally spoke. I was afraid they'd see me for nothing. Elsie met his gaze. What hurt wasn't the accusation, she said. It was being abandoned by the one person I believed in. Shame burned deeper than pain. I forgive you, she said quietly. But not the man who stayed silent. She tied a frayed blue ribbon around his cut, her fingers gentle. He rested his hand against hers, a promise without words. I won't leave again, he whispered. She didn't answer, but she leaned close, sharing warmth against the stone. 2 days. That was all they had. The judge was coming. The baby would be taken to an orphanage. That night Jonas wrote a confession, sealing it with his family brand. He gave it to Elsie. If they won't listen, he said, I'll make them. She looked at him, really looked, and nodded. They weren't waiting for rescue anymore. They were becoming it. It was barely dawn when the sound reached the square, the slow creak of wheels and the tired snort of horses pulling something heavier than the morning air itself. The townsfolk had already begun to gather outside the courthouse, drawn by habit, by fear, by the quiet thrill of watching a final judgment unfold. Heads turned as the carriage rolled in, weather-worn, coated in prairie dust, its paint dulled by miles of running instead of resting. 3 figures stepped down. Henry Montrose first, thinner than anyone remembered, his coat hanging loose on his frame. Beside him, Lillian Montrose, her face pale and drawn, eyes rimmed red from nights without sleep. Behind them came a man in a dark suit clutching a leather briefcase, their lawyer, his expression tight with purpose. They looked like ghosts returning to a house they had already burned down. Henry mounted the courthouse steps, boots echoing louder than they should have in the sudden stillness. He lifted his chin and spoke, his voice shaking but strong enough to carry. "We are here to confess." The words landed like a gunshot. The murmurs died. Faces froze. Henry swallowed and continued. He admitted the fraud, the falsified deeds, the fear that had driven them to flee. He looked at Jonas, then at Elsie, and his voice cracked. "In our desperation, we asked Miss Holloway to protect our daughter. We trusted her because she was the best of us. Then we ran. We let her carry our guilt." Lillian stepped forward then, tears spilling freely, crossed the square, and embraced Elsie where she stood guarded. "I am so sorry," she whispered, words breaking apart. Elsie stiffened, then slowly returned the gesture, once, briefly, before stepping back. The town stood silent, shame pressing down harder than judgment ever had. Someone whispered, barely audible, "We tied an angel to a post." The council reconvened for formality alone. The charges dissolved. The letter Jonas had produced was confirmed. The judge was turned back on the road. Jonas felt eyes on him now, curious, conflicted, searching for the man behind the rumor. He didn't bow his head. Elsie didn't smile. Relief wasn't loud. It was a quiet loosening in the chest, a breath finally allowed. Later, beneath the old elm by the jailhouse, Jonas found her. "I want to walk beside you," he said, voice steady. "Not ahead. Not behind." She didn't answer with words. She took his hand. That was enough. A year passed. Blackstone Ranch changed shape. Horses were sold, boards salvaged, fences patched wrong but strong. A nursery and medical outpost grew where pride once stood. Children laughed there now. The baby grew, curls bouncing, calling Elsie Ma and Jonas Pa. They never married. They didn't need to. The town stopped asking. Above the clinic shelf hung the letter, framed, stained, once doubted. A boy asked if it was magic. Elsie smiled and said no. It just needed someone brave enough to lose everything. Jonas planted a white elm in the square where she had stood bound. Beneath it, a plaque read, "The truth stood here once, and we nearly let it die." In the evenings, as lanterns glowed and cicadas hummed, Jonas sat beside Elsie on the porch. "I thought I'd miss being respected," he said once. "But I missed being worth it." She nodded. Nothing more needed saying. Because sometimes the truth didn't need shouting. Sometimes it only needed someone to stay. The year did not soften Calico Ridge. It did not suddenly become kinder or wiser or gentler with its judgments. Dust still settled thick on boots, rumors still traveled faster than wagons, and men still measured worth by what could be owned, branded, or inherited. But one thing changed, quietly and without ceremony. People remembered. They remembered the woman who stood in the square and did not scream. They remembered the man who stayed silent too long and then spoke when it cost him everything. And memory, in a town like Calico Ridge, carried weight. Blackstone Ranch no longer looked like the place Jonas Vance had once poured his pride into. The fences leaned, patched with boards that didn't match. The barn roof dipped on one side where a beam had cracked and been repaired with stubborn hands instead of money. The porch paint peeled in long curls, exposing wood-weathered silver by sun and wind. But there was life there now, loud and uncontained. Children's voices floated across the fields, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the rhythmic knock of buckets against well stone. The ranch had become something else, something no ledger could measure. Where horses once filled the stalls, there were cots now, clean sheets folded tight, shelves lined with jars of salves and bandages. A hand-painted sign hung crooked by the door, its letters uneven but earnest, offering care, rest, and shelter. Elsie ran it without ever naming what she was. She stitched wounds with steady hands, coaxed fever down with cool cloths and patience, taught letters to children who had never seen a book outside a church. She did not call herself a nurse or a teacher. She simply showed up every morning and stayed until the lamps burned low. Jonas worked beside her in his own way. He rose before dawn, repaired what broke, cooked when she forgot to eat, kept the land breathing just enough to support the work they were doing. At night, after the last child was asleep and the house settled into quiet, he sat by the oil lamp and wrote in a small journal. He never filled pages. Often, there was only a word. Hope. Stay. Enough. The baby the Montroses had left behind was not a baby anymore. She toddled through the kitchen, curls bouncing, laughter bright and fearless. She called Elsie Ma without hesitation, called Jonas Pa as if it had always been so. No one corrected her. No one needed to. There had been no wedding, no preacher, no papers signed. The town stopped waiting for one. Some bonds did not require witnesses. In the clinic room, above a worn shelf of books, hung a simple wooden frame. Inside it rested the letter. Water-stained, creased, once called a forgery by men who had never held it with trembling hands. It was not there as proof anymore. It was there as remembrance. A reminder of how easily truth could be crushed, and how fiercely it could survive when protected. Sometimes people paused in front of it longer than necessary. Sometimes they touched the glass and said nothing. One afternoon, a boy with a rattling cough pointed at it and asked if it was magic. Elsie smiled, soft and tired and real. No, she said. It just needed someone brave enough to lose everything. Jonas's final act for the town came quietly, as most of his did. In the spring, when the ground softened and the air smelled of thaw, he dug a hole in the very center of the square. The same place where Elsie had once stood bound, accused, nearly broken. He worked alone, shirt dark with sweat, hands blistered, refusing help. He planted a white elm, its roots wrapped careful, its branches thin but alive. Beneath it, he set a small wooden plaque, carved by his own hand. The words were simple. The truth stood here once, and we nearly let it die. People noticed. They came by slowly, as if approaching a grave. Some left wildflowers. Some only stood for a moment before walking away, heads bowed. No one removed the plaque. No one dared. Because everyone knew. And knowing, at last, was enough. In the evenings, as cicadas hummed and lanterns glowed warm against the dark, Jonas and Elsie sat on the porch. The world beyond the ridge still rushed and shouted and judged, but there, it softened. Hope slept heavy against Elsie's lap, breath slow and trusting. Jonas leaned back, boots off, watching the sky deepen from gold to indigo. Once, Elsie turned to him, her voice barely louder than the night. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The horses. The auctions. The respect." Jonas thought for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I thought I would," he said. "But I don't miss being respected. I missed being worth it." She nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. Because sometimes the truth did not need to be shouted. Sometimes love did not begin with a vow. Sometimes it began when someone stayed, when it would have been easier to run. And in Calico Ridge, where silence once condemned a woman, staying became the bravest thing anyone could do.